if the United States were to seriously consider buying the Mogami-class frigates from Japan, instead of building its own FFX frigate based on the Legend-class Coast Guard cutter, it would represent a profound shift in how the US Navy thinks about warship acquisition. Industrial policy matters. Build American matters, at least politically, and perhaps pragmatically as a way to reboot the US shipbuilding industry. Moreover, the two frigates belong to different places along the spectrum of trade-offs between cost and capability. Acquiring the Mogami would force a rethink about force structure and what the US Navy actually wants a frigate to do. At first glance, the Mogami is a tempting proposition. It is modern, already in service, by all accounts reliable, and designed by a technologically capable ally. It's built with many of the attributes Western navies say they want: high automation, strong anti-submarine warfare, credible offensive firepower, and solid air defense in its upgraded form. For a US Navy bruised by decades of surface combatant acquisition trouble, the idea of buying something that already exists and works has obvious appeal. Compared against the Mogami is the FFX frigate that the US Navy is planning to build. It's based on the hull of the Legend-class national security cutter, operated by the US Coast Guard. It's of a similar size to the Mogami, at 4,700 tons compared to 5,500 tons for the Japanese frigate. However, the FFX is a deliberately restrained platform designed for affordability, speed of construction, and reduction in delivery risk. It's supposed to absorb lower-intensity missions from the US Navy's overstretched destroyer force. Let's start with the upsides. Buying the Mogami to become the US Navy's next frigate would bring certain benefits. One of the clearest advantages is maturity. The Mogami class is real, already sailing, and being delivered on schedule. Japan has already absorbed the design risk, systems integration challenges, and early operational lessons. For the United States, buying the Mogami would short-circuit years of development and testing. In a strategic environment where the availability of ships matters, that time saved is not trivial. Every year shaved off a program is another year of presence and deterrence. Of course, having a ship ready sooner means it will reach full operating capability sooner. Capability and firepower are the second major attraction. The Mogami is not a minimalist frigate. It is a high-end escort, designed from the outset to operate in contested waters against capable adversaries. Its primary focus on anti-submarine warfare aligns closely with one of the US Navy's most enduring challenges for frigates, particularly in the Pacific. The ship's quietening measures, sonar integration, helicopter facilities, and ability to deploy unmanned vessels make it well suited to tracking and deterring submarines across large maritime approaches. The upgraded Mogami variant adds substantially more firepower to another key naval warfare domain, area air defense. With 32 vertical launch cells, it is far more heavily armed than the planned FFX, which deliberately omits built-in VLS altogether. This alone makes the Mogami fundamentally different in kind from the FFX. A frigate with VLS can carry surface-to-air missiles, anti-submarine rockets, and potentially strike weapons. A frigate without VLS cannot. Containerized missiles that are planned to go on the FFX can add some punch, but they cannot replicate the integration, reaction time, or volume of fire of a built-in vertical launch system. If the US Navy bought the Mogami, it would be buying a ship that can actually contribute to air defense in a task group. FFX cannot do that in its baseline form. Automation is another area where the Mogami stands out. With a crew of roughly 90, the ship reflects a design philosophy that treats manpower as a scarce resource. This aligns uncomfortably well with the US Navy's own personnel challenges, from recruitment shortfalls to rising life cycle cost driven by crew size. A highly automated ship does not just save sailors, it reduces training pipelines and long-term operating expenses. Over a 30-year service life, these savings compound. There is also a strategic and political upside. Buying the Mogami would deepen defense industrial ties with Japan at a time when Washington is explicitly trying to strengthen Allied integration in the Western Pacific region. A common hull operating across Allied fleets would simplify exercises, logistics, and even operational planning. In a high-end contingency, a US Navy equipped with the Mogami would find it easier to operate alongside the Japanese Navy or the JMSDF. Of course, while the Mogami offers important benefits, there are important disadvantages to consider. That should be obvious, because the main stakeholder, the US Navy, have chosen not to buy them. Let's now turn our attention to these drawbacks and explore them in detail. The first major disadvantage is cost. Mogami is a high-end frigate. It is not cheap. Japan built it to replace aging destroyers and escorts in a high-threat environment. The US Navy's FFX is being built to be affordable and built in numbers. Even if the Mogami were procured efficiently, adapted for US systems, and procured under license, it would likely be more expensive per hull than the FFX. And the US Navy does not have a capability per ship problem. It has a not enough ship problem. The Navy needs a lot more fighting ships in the water, doing escort, patrol, and lower intensity day-to-day work. Buying a smaller number of highly capable frigates instead of a larger number of modest ones would undermine the very reason the FFX exists. Mogami would not free up destroyers in the way FFX is meant to, because it would itself be too valuable to assign to routine, low-end missions. The second disadvantage of the Mogami acquisition is industrial. The US Navy is trying to stabilize and expand its domestic shipbuilding base. FFX is explicitly designed to be modular, with sections built at multiple yards and assembled at a lead yard. That spreads work across the country, builds shipyard capacity, and reduces risk. The FFX program is explicitly tied to revitalizing and rationalizing the US shipbuilding base. Modular construction, domestic yards, and distributed manufacturing are not just technical choices, they are political and strategic ones. Buying the Mogami from Japan would shift work overseas. At least some of the work, particularly around design and testing, would be done in Japan. The benefits in terms of providing experience to American shipyards and encouraging them to invest in capacity would be less than the FFX. Furthermore, even with licensed production, the intellectual property and much of the systems engineering would remain foreign. That weakens US control over its own naval architecture ecosystem. There is also a political reality here. Congress is far more willing to fund a domestic program that supports US yards and US jobs than one that involves importing a foreign design wholesale. Even if the Mogami were superior in many ways, it would face headwinds on Capitol Hill that the FFX does not. The third disadvantage is that Mogami's capability profile overshoots what FFX is meant to be. This is where your force structure framing really matters. The US Navy wants frigates to take over lower intensity missions from its more capable, large surface combatants, the destroyers and the cruisers. That is the entire logic of the frigate program. FFX is not supposed to be a mini destroyer. It is supposed to be good enough for permissive environments, maritime security against lesser threats, and routine patrol, while destroyers do the more demanding tasks like ballistic missile defense, land attack, and high-end air defense for the fleet. Mogami sits on a higher point of the cost capability curve. It is designed to fight in contested waters as part of a frontline escort force. That makes it closer to a higher intensity combatant than the US Navy actually wants the FFX to be. Buying the Mogami would blur the line between frigates and destroyers again, recreating the same structural problems around force composition the US Navy is trying to escape. It would remove any prospect of producing any meaningful high-low mix in the Navy. The US Navy already has Aleberg destroyers doing too much. Meanwhile, the unglamorous but essential work of presence and security would still fall back onto expensive ships. The fourth disadvantage is integration risk. The Mogami is designed around Japanese systems and weapons. Japanese radars, Japanese Type 12 anti-ship missile, Japan's Type 23 naval SAM, and Japanese combat systems. Adapting the Mogami to US requirements would not be trivial. The US Navy would want its own combat management system, its own data links, its own weapons, its own electronic warfare architecture. Furthermore, the US Navy has deeply ingrained operational cultures around redundancy, watchkeeping, and damage control. Not to say that the Japanese Navy's culture is worse or anything like that, but different militaries have different focuses and priorities. Shaping the Mogami to carry American weapons and systems and fit American requirements mean redesigning large parts of the ship. At that point, you are no longer buying Mogami. You are creating a US Mogami hybrid that risks becoming exactly the kind of reshaped foreign design that's doomed earlier Constellation-class program. It would be Frame all over again. The FFX, on the other hand, as a purely American design, does not have that kind of problem. In the end, the choice between the Mogami and FFX is not a referendum on Japanese technologies or American competence. It is a question of what the US Navy needs. Mogami offers sheer capability and a proven design. In contrast, the FFX offers affordability, industrial alignment, and force structure balance at the cost of raw combat power. The US Navy has chosen to proceed with the FFX based on the Legend-class cutter, signaling that it views this path as better aligned with its strategy and industrial priorities than buying the Mogami. But what do you think? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.